almost 30 years ago, this session is particularly fun for me to do because exactly almost 30 years ago in the summer of 1995, a first-year MBA student came and spent 2 hours with Bibek. He does not remember that. That first-year MBA student wanted advice on labor markets, and that first-year MBA student was repeatedly pushed back on how labor markets don't allow businesses, and how I should not be a businessman, and how I should not think like an MBA when I come back from my MBA. And I came back in '96, and that business plan was my first company and obviously led to my second company. And that was when Bibek was at NCAER in the summer of 1995. So it's a particularly fun thing for me to do. I think the topic is obvious to everybody. Nobody understands what it means. It has been chosen by Bibek. But I think at some level, I completely relate to it. The key to a successful marriage is a little deafness and blindness. And the key to any policy partnership, any policy advice is obviously a little bit of deafness and blindness if you want to be part of the team. But it's also, is it all art? Is it science? How do you think about means versus ends? How do you think about doing it publicly, privately? How much is intuitive? How much is rigorous? Are absolutely wonderful questions that Bibek has struggled or thought about, at least I know, for years. And so it's my pleasure to ask him to speak. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Manish. And thank you, Karthik, and thanks, Poonam. It's always wonderful to be here at NCAER. I'm not sure who, probably Anil rather than Poonam, asked me what I was going to talk on. And I reacted with this title with the complete assurance that no one would be able to figure out what it means. There is a certain sense in which I suggested this title, which I will explain in a minute. It's of course a takeoff on the standard expression, discretion is the better part of valor, which of course is the other way around in Shakespeare, but that doesn't really matter. Both Karthik and Manish thought I meant discretion in the sense of being discreet. But the word discretion has multiple meanings. And as you will see, I do not mean the word discretion in the sense of being discreet. This is supposed to be a policy maker's lecture. So Poonam probably expects, NCAER probably expects, someone working within the government should come and deliver this lecture and say, hey, look, these are the problems we are facing. These are the issues that we want answers to. And here we have got a body of researchers, and we expect this body of researchers to research these issues and tell us the answers to those questions. That, I presume, would be the standard format for any policy maker's lecture. Who is a policy maker? And who are we assembled here? Most of us who are assembled here belong to the sorority or fraternity of economists. And we are also policy makers to the extent that we work on applied economics. We offer advice. which sometimes, not always, is used by policy makers, which under the Constitution can be the executive arm of the union government, it can be the legislative arm, it can even be the judicial wing, and ditto for state governments and even local governments. My first interaction or my first interface with policy, so to speak, to a certain extent, whenever we work on something that is applied, whenever we work on something that has to do with the Indian economy, we are working on policy. But I mean, my first interface when I was actually asked to look at policy was around the year 1989. In the year 1989, I was a professor at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. 1989, remember, was before the 1991 reforms were introduced. In 1989, the Ministry of Commerce asked IIFT and thereby me to do a study to examine the import regime. Import regime not in the sense of tariffs, but in the sense of quantitative restrictions. And those of you who recall, at that time imports and exports were divided into three different categories. There was OGL, Open General License, which of course is an oxymoron, because if it is open, there should not be any question of there being a license about it. But that is a bit similar to what we did subsequently when we were opening of FDI and we talked about automatic approval. Again, if it is automatic, why use the expression approval? But let me get back to 1989. So, there was this category both for imports and exports, which was open general license. There was a second category which said prohibited, and there was a third category which said restricted, meaning to import or export that item, you needed a license. At that time, item number 17 on that list, item number 16 on that list was cattle and other animals. Item number 17 was donkeys. And I tried to wrap my head around this, that who on earth decided that donkeys deserve to be in a category of their own and cannot be clubbed with cattle and other animals. I got no satisfactory answer. For years and years, even after the 1991 reforms, in the list of exports permitted subject to a license, this continued for almost 7 or 8 years after the 1991 reforms. In the list of exports subject to a license, you would find you could export pomfrets, the fish. But if the fish was caught in the waters of 10 designated ports which were named, you could export it if it weighed more than 300 grams. If it was caught anywhere else, you could export it if it weighed more than 200 grams. So, from the customs point of view, every time an exporter was trying to export pomfret fish, the customs inspector would have to figure out how much the fish weighed on an average and in what waters it had been caught. Those of you who are old enough to remember, in those days there used to be an Exim policy. Well, there still is after a fashion, but not that old thick Exim policy. There was a joint chief controller of exports and imports named Takat Ram, who wrote the policy during the day and interpreted the policy in the evening through his private publication, which sold much more than the official Exim policy. When I speak about discretion, when I use the word discretion, I meant discretion in this particular sense of arbitrariness. In the mid 1990s, I was an economic advisor of sorts in the Ministry of Finance. At that time, there were 5 economic advisors in Finance Ministry. Well, some were called economic advisors, some were called advisors, doesn't really matter, and they all reported to the chief economic advisor, who at that time was Shankaracharya. My portfolio was balance of payments. I soon realized within government, the important files only arrived at 5:25 p.m. When you are exhausted at the end of a day, and presumably therefore you would not have the mind space required to focus on these files. Since my portfolio is the balance of payments, a whole lot of stuff connected with trade used to come. And the typical file that came from the Commerce Ministry was, on such and such an item, the duty drawback rate is X%. It is now proposed it should be made X.25%. Who decided, how did someone decide that it ought to be X% originally? And what was the rationale now for suggesting that it should be X.25%? There was no satisfactory answer, and I had sleepless nights with such files until I decided on something very simple. Any proposal that came from the Commerce Ministry, you should oppose. That resolved my dilemma. Since 1991, there have been reforms. At the India Policy Forum, we will talk about reforms as they have happened, as they are happening, as they should happen. Each one of us, when we define reforms, we have a certain prism with which we look at reforms. Whichever way you define reforms, one particular definition of reforms is ending discretion, removing arbitrariness, removing discretion. And when I gave you those examples of discretion, many of you laughed because they were ridiculous examples. They should not be there. But the policy dilemma I want to present before you is it invariably the case that we accept the argument that discretion is bitter? Is it invariably the case that we accept that discretion is the bitter part of advice? is it invariably the case that we as economists oppose discretion? It is very easy for us as economists to castigate members of parliament or members of the legislature because of the arbitrariness, because of the subjectivity. The question I am posing before all of us, reminiscent of the oracle of Delphi, know thyself, or if you prefer Indian text, Atmanang Vidhi, is we, when we offer policy advice, do we argue against discretion? Let me give some examples of this. In the pending agenda of tax reform, in the pending agenda of reforms, we have tax reforms. Tax reforms have a direct tax component, they have an indirect tax component, and of course, there are import tariffs. Of course, now there is the IGST, there can be additional duties, but let us just talk about the basic customs duty. There is the cliched quote that goes back to Keynes, written in a different context, about defunct economists. Take import duties. What is our collective policy advice as economists on import duties? In all probability, most of us would say that tariffs on basic goods should be lowest, that on intermediate goods should be higher, and that on finished goods should be highest. Sounds very good. But the moment it comes to a question of implementing this, sitting there in Commerce Ministry or Finance Ministry or wherever, the person who is going to implement this advice is going to rack his or her head over what is a basic good, what is an intermediate good, and what is a finished good. And therefore, the discretion and the arbitrariness goes on, and then having delivered the advice from the outside, we criticize what the government has been doing, and we say, look, there is tariff escalation or whatever, the effective rates of protection are being messed up. Whether you agree with the proposition or not, the elimination of discretion requires all tariffs to be uniform. Let us move to other aspects of taxes, the GST. I don't know about all, most economists would probably argue that the GST rate should be very similar to tariffs, that the GST rate should be lowest on essentials, higher on standard goods, and highest on whatever we choose to call them, demerit goods. Let us say 6%, 12% and 18%. But then the GST Council will go round and round in circles, trying to decide what is a merit good, what is a standard good, and what is a demerit good. I need to remind you that the original modeling for the GST adding to 1.5 to 2% of GDP growth was done by NCER for the Finance Commission, and that particular modeling exercise involved only one single GST rate. But again, pointing the finger inwards, I am going to ask, how many economists would advocate a single GST rate? On direct taxes, how many economists would advocate a complete elimination of all exemptions? We perpetually complain about chambers of commerce lobbying before North Block and arguing, and typically chambers of commerce do this, arguing remove the exemptions for everyone else, retain them from me. But as economists who offer policy inputs, how many of us argue, I am not looking deliberately at Sudhir Bhalla, how many of us argue remove all exemptions? I can go on and on, I am running out of time, silo by silo. We create, in terms of the advice that we give, the discretion, and facilitate the abuse that results from the discretion. Take the rural-urban distinction. Yes, there is a census definition, but it breaks down everywhere. How many of us will argue, let us completely eliminate the rural-urban distinction, let us unify the 73rd and the 74th constitutional amendments? Because the moment I treat rural differently from urban, the policies will be different, the land laws will be different, the land conversion laws will be different, and the moment these are different, there will be subjectivity, there will be discretion, there will be rent seeking. Think of the way we look at farmers, think of the way we look at agriculture, think of the way we look at labor laws, think of the way we look at informal, formal, think of the way we look at MSME vis-a-vis the corporate sector. How did the reforms start? The 1991 reforms. Well, World Bank, IMF, policy advice from here, there, everywhere. What we often fail to recognize is the internal advice that came internally much before the crisis of 1990-91. One person or one committee I think we should remember is the Dagley Committee of 78. The Dagley Committee of 78, the Alexander Committee of 1990, the Abid Hussain Committee of 85, particularly the Dagley Committee. All of these, particularly the Dagley Committee on Controls and Subsidies, argued against discretion. And my submission before all of you is that as economists, I don't think we have accepted that message of reforms meaning an end to discretion, which is the reason why our advice often tends to be bitter. Thank you very much.
Is this on? No? Yes? No. Thank you so much. And thanks for a cryptic title that left a lot of us guessing, but delivering a very important message. So let me just ask one question. I think part of the old joke about wanting a one-handed economist, right? And part of doing nuanced economic research, modeling, empirics is often reaching a conclusion that says the optimal policy depends on different conditions. So, but is the way we should take the main message from your talk is that there are certain amounts of discretion that show up as optimum in a series of economic models, but when implemented through an administrative state that will essentially be somewhat arbitrary in making these decisions, that it's almost impossible. And therefore, we need a theory of second or third best with regard to policy recommendations that almost puts simplicity and lack of discretion as a primary objective function, given that these ideas have to be implemented through an administrative state. Is that a fair characterization of your main message?
Thank you, Karthik. It's a diplomatic characterization. I wouldn't say it's a fair characterization. I think the fair characterization is for us as economists to say, and it's very difficult for economists to say that. It's difficult for anyone to say that. It's difficult for MPs to say that. It's difficult for MLAs to say that. I don't know. I don't know is an expression that is very difficult to come out with, particularly if I have been given the hallowed mantle of offering advice. I don't know means, if I accept that, it means I will say, I do not know whether you should push sector X or sector Y. I do not know what deserves to be part of PLI and what does not. I do not know whether such and such an area deserves a special economic zones or not. So, the correct answer is we are very reluctant to say, I don't know, whereas the message of the reforms is, in a dynamic context, it is the individual decision makers who will decide. Any modeling that I do today is static. It's ex ante, ex post it will be proved wrong, but meanwhile, because of the ex ante advice, I am stuck in this discretionary box.
So if I can just do a quick follow-up to that. I mean, I think, so I mean, in some ways, to be honest, and I think Seema's talk today was a very good example of presenting a set of, where is Seema? Of presenting a set of facts and then on policy saying, I don't know, right? I mean, and I think my sense is academics typically don't have a problem, right? I mean, saying, I don't know. I think the problem, and this was something, people in policy have said, that when you're in the government, whether you know or not, decisions are being taken, and so then you owe the decision maker your best judgment with regard to what, in the end, it's all probabilistic, but you still need to make decisions. And so how does your, mea culpa of saying, I don't know, apply to that situation where the decision is going to happen in either case?
Okay, so let me see, this becomes a bit like a caricature. Who is this economist? This economist is writing a paper in a refereed journal, in which case the economist is very careful and will therefore effectively say, I do not know except what my research shows. But then that very same economist is requested to give advice. And when you are requested to give advice, whether it is in consultations with the finance minister or elsewhere, it becomes very difficult to say, I do not know. And therefore, you venture your opinion on A, B and C without necessarily remembering or ignoring the assumptions and the various qualifications on the basis of which your answers are based. In other words, you have answers to a specific context, you tend to generalize them, and therefore, in all seriousness, because I trust your wisdom, that's why I have invited Karthik, not don't take it personally. So, I take a decision on the basis of the advice that Karthik has offered me, but Karthik, in offering that advice, is not sufficiently careful. That's the point I am making.
So yeah, I mean, I can ask more questions, but I think this really is now for the audience and it's a short session. So Ram, please.
Thank you for laying out a fascinating agenda for an important issue from policy point of view, but also from pure intellectual research point of view also. Wherever a society has to frame rules, as you said, there are two choices: either to use discretion ex ante in deciding, in laying out detailed rules, or exercise discretion ex post. The challenge is that these discretions are assigned to different set of people. Policy makers versus those ex post use the rules or the discretion assigned to them. To me, it seems sensible to give discretion to set of group people who know better. I'm assuming even though we do not know everything about an issue, but some of us are better informed policy makers versus those are going to execute the list of import items. So the twofold criteria would be who has got better information and whose incentives are better aligned with society. It also seems to me that it depends on the state capacity also. Capacity of legislatures, judges versus a capacity of the executive branch. What are your thoughts? Is it right way to look at this issue? Is it a good guide to decide who should get discretion and how much?
Could I add to that? There are 26,410 ways for employers to go to jail in this country, but there's not many CEOs in jail. And so when we put out that number, people in the government got angry saying, well, there's no CEO in jail, why are you hopping on this? And I mean, sort of like, my favorite line in the Vishnu Sahasranam roughly translates to, why did God create fear? So he could take it away, right? Essentially, you create that fear. So that's discretion. And Ram's question and mine would be is the 26,410 to be dealt upstream where you don't put it in? Or is it to be dealt downstream when you decide that I won't put anybody in jail?
I think, you see, the trouble with the way Ram has phrased it is whenever we are talking about advice, we are talking about advice that is ex ante. And I don't know means a recognition that ex post I don't know what is going to happen. So ex ante I should standardize and unify as much as is possible. Now let's take your example and then I have something to say on Ram's. Your example is in the context of what? It's in the context of 29 union government level labor codes being unified under 4, and also in the process, in some pieces of legislation, imprisonment being replaced with fines. This is the context. Often as economists, particularly if you are interested in exports, we mention Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a single unified employment code. I think it's had it since 2006. What has union government done? Union government has done, by the way, for those who do not know, I think everyone here knows, that every statute is administered by a certain department or a certain ministry. What has the union government done? It has unified all the codes that are labor codes that are administered by the Ministry of Labor. If I am interested in labor, shouldn't MGA and REGA be part of the broader labor employment issue? So, if I am looking at unification, should I not be considering the whole lot? Now, the way I would react to your question is, it depends on who you are pointing the finger at. I said it's easy to point the finger at the government. The thrust of my talk was to point the finger also at us as a group. How many people writing on labor have said what I have just said? Please unify. Do not have separate definitions of establishments and enterprises. Do not have separate definitions of employees and workmen. In other words, the four codes have unified and people have applauded them. But how many people have said, go the whole hog? To take Ram's example, not Ram's example, to take an example that Ram would empathize with and all of us would empathize with, because Ram is interested in the law. Changing tax a little bit. What does the law of the land say? The law of the land says that the death sentence is to be awarded only in the rarest of rare cases. Some 4 years ago, Ram will give you the exact date, the Delhi Law School did an experiment with 3 completely hypothetical cases which were known. I mean, they were known to be hypothetical cases. And they administered a questionnaire with those hypothetical cases to retired judges of the High Court and the Supreme Court, judges who had actually awarded the death sentence. When they did this, they found that these judges, retired judges, who had themselves awarded the death sentence in the past, did not themselves agree on whether these 3 hypothetical cases constituted the rarest of the rare or not. Now, what would standardizing this mean? Standardizing this in this particular case would mean either we completely scrap the death sentence, or we have very clear objective criteria with no subjectivity on where the death sentence can be imposed, generalizing this in a vast number of cases, not just criminal law, but, well, particularly criminal law. I have a huge range of discretion given to the judge. The moment I have that discretion, I will have variations in case law. And this is one particular example of what discretion does. And the broad thrust is, in terms of a positive list and a negative list, which is what we used to have a long time ago, if I do not know, I will say that unless something is in the negative list, everything is permissible. But because I have not given up the mindset, and because I think I still know whether I am the economist offering advice or whether I am the member of parliament, I am inclined to, my first reaction is to say, my default template is to say that I will go by a positive list. This is what is permitted. Everything that is not permitted is prohibited. Now, the proposition I am advancing is, we as economists have not accepted that mindset change, that reforms require markets to decide. Reforms require us to say, we don't know. How on earth do I know what is going to happen in a village in Tamil Nadu? So, let me say I do not know, and therefore, let me standardize, unify, harmonize ex ante.
I more than substantially what has been said and what Bibek has concluded. I want to, so what are the origins? It's still not. Oh, so what are the origins of discretion? And I want to, I'll end up with an optimistic, as usual, conclusion. The origins of discretion are, first, no accountability in the past, or little accountability in the past because of little information. So you can't be proven wrong or whatever. Second, let's not forget the political economy, which is a lot. There are lots of people benefiting from discretion, not only the people administering the discretion, but others. Third, ideology. So all of this leads to the simple conclusion that we basically, as economists, very few of us, if any, are one-armed economists. We love, we are honored, they are seeking our advice, and the background is all of this accountability stuff. I can't be proven wrong, there's somebody paying me money, not paying me money, or whatever. So I come to give options. Do this, but on the other hand, remember, on the other hand, the first lesson we learned in economics, on the other hand, this can also happen. And therefore, we leave it to the politician to decide. So the fault, dear Brutus, is in us. Now, where do I get to be optimistic? We are now living in a world of massive information. Most of us would think information overload, but there's a positive side to all of this information. Fewer and fewer economists will be one-armed in the future or even at present.
Nothing really to say to that. I mean, if I, as everyone here knows, if you disagree with Surjit, you will not hear the end of it. But Surjit, the broad point is, and I'm sort of repeating what I said with a different example, that we can think of the MRTP Act, but the inputs for the MRTP Act came from the Dutt Committee and the Hazare Committee. And to endorse what you are saying, rare is the economist, when offered to give advice, will say, here is a basket of options. If you do A, this is what will happen. If you do B, this is what will happen. Typically, the economist will choose one out of the A, B, C, D, and that is where the problem starts.
Devesh?
Vivek, one could make an argument that because we don't know the sort of future, in fact, precisely because of that, we might want some discretion. And I'll give you an example. The US had, like the case you said about the judges here.
Can you hold the mic a bit closer?
Judges used to have a fair bit of discretion in sentencing. Then in the late 90s, they passed a law called 3 strikes and you're out, right? And it led to massive problems because the judges had no discretion, however small the third strike was or the third crime was, they had to sentence. So what began to happen in the US was the number of inmates in jail hugely multiplied. And it was very clear that people were being sentenced for very small acts, but precisely because the judges had no discretion whatsoever. So I want to push you a little bit whether it is indeed the case that having no discretion is necessarily better.
I don't think the answers are ever binary, because part of what I did was an attempt to deliberately caricature so as to provoke. Nonetheless, my response would be something like this. again a little bit of a caricature. The US, with all its warts and blemishes, is fundamentally a market-based economy. Our economy, with all the reforms, is essentially one subjected to heavy-handed state intervention. So I think the historical social contexts are somewhat different, particularly given the temptation in a country like India that I must do something for the poor, and a large element of discretion comes from this intention of doing something for the poor, however they may be defined. My response to your question would be, in the US, which subject to all the question marks is essentially market based, I can understand the argument for discretion, and both have their pluses and minuses. But in a society and in an economy where we have been familiar with a heavy dose of discretion since 47 or certainly since 1950, I would tend to err on the side of end of discretion, because I think the costs are going to be lower thereby.
Sorry, I think I had Ajay, and then I'll take it at the back.
So, Vivek, my point is slightly different. I mean, is a different model of for the economists to work with the government also on the cards? For example, I mean, if it's a one-shot ex ante, ex post stuff, I can see these sorts of issues. But I also see a trust gap. Are you sort of somewhere at the back of your mind, is there a different model for economists to work with the government on an ongoing basis, developing trust and sort of a lot of back and forthing, almost think of an extended version of the Economic Advisory Council, for example?
I'm not thinking of the Economic Advisory Council. I was thinking of the broader ecosystem of economists who might offer advice to the Economic Advisory Council. So let me state the issue in the following fashion. We can sit down here and list out the priority areas for reform, whatever they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere down the line we'll have a consensus on 10 most important ones. Then let us ask ourselves the question, on item 1, what would a complete removal of discretion mean? Is that a possibility we at all contemplate? Or do we contemplate, no, we've got a problem with urban land law, so let me try and do something under Article 243Q of the Constitution? Are we asking the basic principle, first principles question? In this particular area, what does it mean to eliminate discretion completely? And let's take it forward from there. And obviously every area is not important. The most important ones really are taxes broadly defined, land, labor, and almost everything else follows from that. I can talk about monetization of assets also, but in each and every one of these you will find the case is being made out for A is special.
I'll take the question at the back.
Yeah.
And then to Martin.
So I just wanted to ask, is your point very similar to Prescott and Kirtland about time consistency versus rules in the context of monetary policy?
Well, if you state it like that and force me to say yes, I will have to say yes. But I guess at an abstract level, yes.
Martin?
So I'm an outsider, I suppose. I missed the very early beginning for various reasons. I apologize. What I've heard is absolutely fascinating. So let me push make a comment and then push you on something for me to understand. So in 1974, I became the World Bank's country economist on India, and my first job was to explain to my bosses what that year's import control regime meant. And I probably worked harder on that report than any I've ever worked on in my life. And I think I did a fairly good job, and the bottom line was, I have no idea. So I think I can go along very much with the early description, so much so that my very first book was on India's trade policy. The question is this, and that's probably where I missed the opening, for which I apologize. Most of us think it's desirable to reduce or eliminate discretion. And you are saying, with which I entirely agree if I understand it, that to do so you have to take what many of us would regard as rather radical positions on things like tax systems and so forth, with which I would agree. But isn't there another possible way of thinking about it, which I think is linked to the last question, which is to try to distinguish, which is hard, but not impossible, I think, those areas of policy and the sorts of policy areas where discretion is pretty clearly harmful, which is of course judgmental, from those, and I would include monetary policy, probably financial regulation, responses to pandemics, responses to wars, where discretion is inescapable. And isn't the necessary next step in the analysis you provided us with, apart from noting the many failures of economists, an attempt to distinguish those different areas of policy with which economists are engaged?
On the first part, the comment part, on the face of it, the import regime has become simpler, certainly on the quantitative restriction part of it. But it hasn't exactly become simpler on the tariff part of it because of the reasons that I mentioned. On the last bit, I would be very reluctant to judge areas where discretion is desirable vis-a-vis areas where discretion is undesirable. And remember, this entire context is the context of framing of economic policies, that too domestic economic policies. And most of these domestic economic policies no longer involve only the union government, they involve state governments. In this context, this is a sort of a reiteration of what I said in response to the earlier question. Trying to decide where discretion is desirable and when it is not is itself an act of discretion. Instead, what I would prefer is what I said in the earlier response, is these are the most important priority areas for reform. Let us figure out what would happen if I completely removed discretion in these. And I repeat, the priority areas would probably be, given what I said about domestic economic policies, would probably be taxation, would probably be subsidies, would probably be land, would probably be labor, and it would probably be, well, I said subsidies, so tangentially in some sense user charges. If you just did these five, I think you would have covered the major pending agenda of reforms. So that would be my response.
I wanted to just shift you a little bit from discretion, because if the transmission losses between how the law was written, interpreted, practiced, and enforced disappeared, corporate India would shut down, right? You can't comply with 100% of India's labor laws without violating 10% of them, and many other areas I can give you. But let me just pull you back from discretion and just reflect on your career a little bit. That, you know, we've often talked about, at least in my area, skills, education, labor. How do you get something done in government after everybody who matters in government agrees with you? right? After the spiritual sort of level of agreement, the real challenge, but there are some ideas, and you've worked in many of them, which after agreement really go to all the way. What is your reflection on everybody agreeing on stuff and the stuff that gets done? What are the characteristics of those ideas, or is it the personalities? Is it just Leo Tolstoy's, the most powerful warriors are time and patience? Or is it the people?
No, Manish, rare is the case where you get a consensual view. You've dragged me into an area that I did not want to speak about, but let me respond nonetheless. Typically, the problem is that whenever we submit advice, saying you standardize, harmonize, back comes the reply or the response that X, Y, Z, revered, respected, wise economist has recommended we should do item 1 for sector X, item 2 for sector Y, item 3 for sector Z. In implementing policy, there are obviously frictions within government, differing points of view, but my thrust of this talk wasn't that. My thrust was that the advice that typically comes is of a nature which encourages the continuation of that discretion.
Thank you. Just to give you my background, I've been away from India for 40 years, 33 years at the IMF, so that you're not surprised with the question I'm going to, or comment I'm going to make. So I have one comment and two questions. The comment is, when you ask this question to us and, about what kind of taxes, tariffs to levy on essential goods versus luxury goods, etc. And I had my standard answer in my head. And your answer was, the lowest on essentials. The answer in my head was 0. So for me, the starting point is you should have no taxes at all. Doesn't matter what kind of goods. So what you're telling, your lecture is actually music to my ears in some sense, because the starting point for India is very different from at least our education and my exposure to many countries. But my question is, actually inside the IMF, and I can speak a little more freely, I was arguing, of course, coming a little bit from the Indian background too, was much more about, markets don't work everywhere. There are market failures. We need to recognize that. That was the internal argument I was having on many countries where I worked and I led missions to. So it was completely the opposite, which was the recognition that markets can fail. And when markets fail, that's where decisions have to be taken. I don't know about whether to call it discretion. And for me, the most important thing then was, obviously one individual cannot decide. So that's where it was very important to get the views of the different stakeholders or different perspectives, including men, women, etc. And that's how one comes to a collective decision, which is the best under circumstance, and you have to do it. So I wonder if you agree with that approach. And the second question is, to the extent that you can talk about your own role, in the Indian case, because there are so many laws and regulations, and labor law is really an incredibly good example of the complication. Do you ever, when you have a discussion on the topics that you mentioned, the 5 areas, say, why don't we do zero budgeting, like we do zero budgeting? Let's assume we have a clean slate of paper. What are we going to put in there? Is that an approach that you take? Thank you.
Well, that last question I will deliberately ignore. Now, when you said 0%, I presume you meant tariffs. The idea for whether it's 0% or 5% is beside the point. The idea of a standardized tariff for all items has been floating around since at least the year 2000. It has found no takers, primarily, not exclusively, primarily because economists have argued to the contrary. Research institutions have argued to the contrary. Now, so far as market failure is concerned, let me react like this. This is a little bit similar to my earlier reaction. I am very skeptical about a market failure argument unless it is demonstrated to me that there is a market failure. One way of paraphrasing what I have said is, let us not create market failures by abuse of discretion. I think we need to wind up. I have to go.
Thank you. We've gone a little bit over, but it's just, it's just wonderful to have your perspectives from the ramparts of government and as having been an economist for a long time. So I think there's a lot of thought-provoking ideas put out there. So let me just thank you and bring the session to a close. Thank you.